Hello and welcome to my talk about the Old Poor Law. I shall hope to show you just what records are available to help you look at your family history, or local history, or even social history. So let's start by looking at what do we mean by the Old Poor Law. This is before the formal introduction of unions and workhouses that occurred in the 19th century. And it was effectively based on the parish, effectively a local welfare state. Everything was done locally, so in a small rural parish, everybody knew everybody else. The people who were actually administering the system knew who these individuals were and what they were like. The advantage we have for our research is that there were very detailed accounts kept, both of the cash paid out and of in-kind payments. So to give you some examples, I'm going to use the documents that we have for the parish of East Ilsley, which is in Berkshire, up in the Downlands area there in England, and we'll show you just what is possible to find sometimes. So let's look at the documents that are available. For East Ilsley, we have a full set of annual accounts showing the totals that were actually raised and paid out for the period of 1701 to 1766. We also have a full listing of all the payments, the detailed accounts, for the period from 1744 to 1790. This is where we have all the information about the individuals that money was paid to. We only have one poor rate list. This is the list that gives the names of everybody who was actually paying the poor rate, and it also will show you how much each person was paying, and those people who didn't have to pay because their facilities were too small, so they were not actually required to pay. We have a few surviving settlement certificates and removal orders from the 18th century, but those are very, very limited. So, do you know what documents survive for your place and who paid the poor rate? This is something that's well worth looking into. To give you an example, this is a page from one of the early account books showing the individuals who were actually paid money during that particular 4-week period. Typically in those early days we were looking at maybe 10 individual payments each 4-week period, but by the time we got to 1770 this had dramatically increased and the overall cost of running the poor rate had significantly increased. So let's look to see who actually received payments. Typically there were 3 types of payments that went out under the poor law. There were regular payments, occasional payments, ones that were only for 1 or 2 months or just one-offs, and then there are all the overseers' expenses. The regular payments were mainly basically what we would call pensions nowadays, I suppose, for the elderly or infirm, widows with young children, orphans. Occasional payments were a bit more irregular. They might be to labourers who could normally support their families but needed a little bit of extra help. They also include the payments that were made to shopkeepers, other artisans, for in-kind payments for the poor. And then we have things like medical and funeral expenses. Overseers' expenses would include travel to go to visit magistrates, the cost of raising warrants and removal orders under settlement systems, maybe paying for apprenticeships to take some of the poor off their lists, and also for things like pest control. I think we have one payment which shows up they were paid a certain amount for 4 dozen sparrows which had been removed from the fields. Initially East Ilsley had a pretty regular set tariff for payments to various people. Elderly couples, for example, would receive 12 shillings a month. Individual widowers who were elderly received 6 shillings. Orphans were paid about the same amount, 6 shillings per month, although it was recognised for small infants that the costs were a bit higher because obviously milk had to be purchased. so that was 8 shillings for an infant. Younger widows who'd got young children were not paid as such to the widow, but for the children, so it was 4 shillings per child. Up until the age of 21 for girls, 18 for boys. That quite surprised me. I expected the poor rate to have stopped paying out much earlier. And this tariff seemed to stay pretty well unchanged during the early years up until about 1770. When costs really started to rise, they had to modify their tariffs and not always pay all these total amounts out each year. So let's look at some examples of the people who received these regular payments. One useful example of a regular payment was an elderly couple, Ignatius Foster and his wife Elizabeth. This was in around the mid-1740s. They were both in their 80s, so it was quite surprising to find people that old still working quite happily, in this case not working, they were unable to work. They received regular payments of 12 shillings up until the death of Elizabeth. It was then reduced to 6 shillings for Ignatius until his death, and then their funeral expenses were paid. Another example of a young widow, Hannah Aldridge. At the time of her husband's death, she had 5 children under the age of 12, and she received payments for those children up until the time she remarried. Once she remarried, those payments stopped. Orphans, this included people like Coleman Sayer. He was an illegitimate child whose mother had died in childbirth. He only survived about 18 months, but during his short life, payments were paid to Robert and Joan Cannons to look after him. That particular couple quite regularly took in orphans and looked after them. So let's look at an example of some of the occasional payments that you'd get paid out. John Arnold was an agricultural labourer with 6 young children, and most of the time he was able to support his family without support from the poor rate. But occasionally, particularly in winter, he would receive occasional payments, typically for work on the highways and things like that, basic labouring costs, and this would be anything from 5p to 8p a day, depending on the work he did. When his young son Robert died, the costs of Robert's funeral were paid for, and also at times there were various payments made for clothes for his children. The other occasional payments that you'll find are generally being paid to shopkeepers or artisans who are providing in-kind supplies to the poor, and the overseers then have to reimburse those people. So these would be typically people like the shoemaker, a grocer, a tailor, people like that. And the other occasional payments would be to the local doctor for medical payments, for medical services, and also things for like the funerals of the poor when they couldn't afford to do things themselves. The cost of the coffin and taking the coffin to the church and burying it, etc. If you're really lucky, you might find details of some of these occasional payments to the shopkeepers and artisans, and I'd like to show you next one of these examples. This is for Thomas Palmer. He was a tailor, and he was providing some clothes for the Ashcombe family in 1767, and we're very lucky in that this particular bill was just slipped inside the book of poor law payments, and it details the costs of all the materials that he used to make those clothes for the Ashcombe family, including the actual cloth, binding, thread, canvas, buttons, etc. And it's kind of detail that is something you wouldn't come across normally. Sometimes you'll come across some items that were quite unexpected. We discovered purely from the poor law documents that there actually was a major smallpox epidemic in the village in 1753. It was actually part of a much wider epidemic in that particular year. We hadn't noticed it because the parish registers for burials happened to be split between 2 volumes just in that period, and nobody had noticed that actually the total number of deaths was far in excess of normal for that particular year. Instead of like around maximum of 10 people a year being buried, we had 27 in 1753. And it's estimated that possibly about 50 to 60 people were infected in the village, and at least 20 of those 27 deaths were from the smallpox. There was nothing in the parish registers to indicate that this had occurred, apart from the actual numbers. The only way to contain the epidemic was basically isolation. But of course, for poor families living in tiny cottages, how do you isolate one member of the family who's got smallpox to avoid the rest of the family being infected? And so they were actually confined to their houses, but they were supported with food supplies, fuel, medical assistance, etc. After this particular epidemic, it was realised that this actually was not a very effective way of doing it, because a lot of the people who were infected because they had been isolated with infected family members. So a little later than 1753, in 1755, the parish actually built a building on the outskirts of the village to act as an isolation unit to keep things separate. And in a little sketch map that we have from a little later on in that time period, it actually shows the location of the lodge. It's right on the eastern extremity of the village, so with the prevailing winds being out of the southwest, that kept the majority of the germs away from the centre of the village. So what can we learn from examining these poor law documents? The detailed accounts give us a fantastic picture of life for these poorest villagers, the Aglabs, who normally leave very few records apart from their births, deaths and marriages. It also includes local farmers, shopkeepers, artisans, either as overseers who actually administer the process or who actually supply services to the poor in some respect. There's a wealth of material there for both social and family history and really understanding your particular location. And it can highlight episodes in the village, such as in this case the smallpox epidemic, that are just not recorded anywhere else. If you'd like to look at some examples of these detailed overseers' accounts and poor rate lists and things like that, if you'd like to go onto our website, eastilsleyhistory.com, you will find a whole load of transcripts of some of the volumes that we have dealt with so far. I hope you'll find them very interesting. Thank you very much.